I'm making this video due to the upcoming and ever anticipating release of Little Nightmares 3, but I kinda wanted to go through parts of the series briefly to better understand the logic of the Nowhere and see if we can find any patterns in the way these games present themselves and what they are trying to say or tell us. There has always been a theme of living through and seeing things with a childlike mind. I mean, this is partly a story of a child's experience with pain and anguish in a nightmare world, but also perseverance and camaraderie, which we see with the runaway kid, and even Six and Mono to some degree, and mistrust at times too. And those emotions and actions kind of follow all the characters we played as or been in the perspective of, so that's kind of our basis, I believe. I think it has been well established that the first Little Nightmares game has an overarching attachment to hunger and perhaps more broadly greed, and the second game is more in the vein of escapism. This is widely known. I believe it is much more than that, but laying it out in a broad way can help us understand this world and branch out our scope, since it's quite difficult to grasp and conjure up any cohesive plot for Little Nightmares. Not that it has to be cohesive, I think that's what a lot of people love about this series. The entrails of Enigma are what the fans will eat up, and I am among that crowd. And I think Little Nightmares really benefits from that enigmatic plot, since it is tackling topics such as abuse of power, specifically in the context of children, the cycle of violence, and even escapism like we mentioned. What I mean by that is we almost get to see this series take these dark themes and pick it apart in a way that is a mirror of reality. If it was too clear, it would just feel like a regular horror series, but Little Nightmares gives you vague ideas to understand this world, to grasp onto. The Nowhere is mirroring aspects of the regular world. Take the teacher. She is unnerving in a multitude of ways. She of course has the overtly terrifying long neck, but also she doesn't blink. She wears quite old-fashioned attire that maybe invokes an era of teaching we don't look back on too fondly. And mostly her ever-knowing, all-seeing presence makes her feel like a twisted mirror version of a real teacher that abuses their power. I don't know if this necessarily applies to all of the monsters in the Nowhere, but I only recently listened to The Sounds of Nightmares, and the Candleman seemed to invoke a sentiment that made me feel adults could enter the Nowhere, but had to be the perpetrator of some sort of misconduct, which would sort of make sense with what I said a minute ago, about the game feeling like you were viewing things through a caricature of a childlike mind. I mean, in the real world, it seems children often get sucked in and are the victims of some kind of abuse. So, it seems maybe the adults in the Nowhere are just mirroring the childlike view the children feel when living within the Nowhere, about the adults in power and that abuses said power. Not really certain at all that we are viewing everything from a childlike mind state per se, but all of the monsters we encounter do point to some role, some status they fulfill that may represent what a child may feel and see. And I think The Sounds of Nightmares sort of bolsters this idea, since the first game, we get to interact with the regular world, we are greeted by Otto, who is an adult with a lot of power over Noon it seems, and he abuses that power by using her as an experiment to begin to understand how he could get to Cece, his sister who was sucked into the Nowhere. I think one thing that does differentiate Otto from the monsters we are used to seeing in the universe is his slight uncertainty. I mean, he's most definitely certain that he wants to find out what happened to his sister, but he also has his doubts on the ethics of his methods, and I almost don't think he truly feels certain in his ability to uncover this mystery. It seems that the monsters within the Nowhere fill that role, as we said, and don't really stray away from it. They have their plans set. I don't really know what to make of this idea the community has conjured up, but it could possibly link back to what I was saying about how children view adults in positions of power. Maybe the Nowhere shows us that these kids start to feel like the real world and the Nowhere are just two sides of the same coin. Adults using power, misusing it, and then repeating a cycle of violence. We see that Noon feels that maybe being in the Nowhere might be worth it due to the feeling more powerful within the Nowhere. And it also does seem the Candleman is similarly abusing some kind of intangible power by making these children think of all the reasons the Nowhere may be a better option than the world they live in. Now, I don't really know if the Candleman does this with malicious intent, since maybe he is filling a role similar to most of these monsters, and I honestly don't know what he is thinking as of now. It is rather hard to contextualise a lot of the droplets of information we are giving when listening or playing through this series, so I do imagine a lot of this discussion is a bit all over the place. I think when beginning to understand Little Nightmares, it is actually most important to understand that a lot of these ideas and theories are up for interpretation, bar a few that have mostly been confirmed. A lot of theories get espoused, which I believe have a lot of weight, but it nevertheless doesn't feel much easier to piece them together. If we briefly go over some significant events within the series, I think we can definitely get some broad strokes on what may be going on. Within the first game, we are upon the Moor, which is sort of a moving ship landmass, kind of steam goth aesthetic, if that's a term. Nonetheless, it has a purpose, like everything within Little Nightmares, and this purpose seems to be to, on the surface, feed the guests. likely a group of filthy socialites within the Society of the Nowhere. When we are making our way through the moor, we meet a few characters that are a cog in the machine of the ship to fulfill this purpose. Six will traverse through, meeting the iconic characters we know, like the janitor, the twin chefs, and the guests themselves. I do quickly want to say that in anticipation for Little Nightmares 3, I do wonder if the guests we saw on the moor are the same kinds of people we see at the fairgrounds. They seem of a similar build, and kind of give off a similarish vibe. I also wonder if the fair that Noon describes in The Sounds of Nightmares is the one and the same too. If so, it seems maybe this fair in Little Nightmares 3 could be a place that these monsters find pleasure and entertainment through the ways of the children, similar to the moor, since there they eat children and at the fair they may watch them perform circus acts. Tangent aside, I do think the lady probably has the most to say about at least an aspect of this world. She is rather brutal in her ways, and I remember loving the scene where she is peering over the guests who are entering the moor, with a mask that hides well what she may be thinking and feeling. Sort of reminds me a lot of the eye imagery within the game. Perhaps she is an eye in some sense. What is known about the lady is that she hides her face and seems deeply afraid of people seeing her face and disgusted with seeing it for herself. I was talking earlier about how it seems like a lot of the monsters in this universe serve some role other than their obvious occupation within the Nowhere. The lady, however, within the Nowhere just sort of looks over the moor's doing, and in a more metaphorical context is also slightly unclear. I think I recall one of the creatures for Little Nightmares turning down the idea it has anything to do with Six and the lady being mother and child, or anything of that nature, but it's easy to see why people think like that. For me, not just because of Six, but because of theories surrounding the granny. I also think if I was to think of the type of role or woman the lady would have been in the regular world, perhaps it was a powerful woman who was an entertainer, and with all the children and doll imagery in her headquarters, maybe she also represents a deeply insecure mother who would project that onto her child, like the idea of the value of beauty being in the public eye. I'm not really sure though. The main things I want to bring up in regards to Little Nightmares 2 is the Thin Man and the time paradox. I do tend to lend my hand more to the idea that the Thin Man is exclusively mono, and not anyone who befools themselves to the condition mono finds himself in the end in so. That would mean that there's most definitely a sort of time loop. I believe this may actually be where the games have a slight connection, because even in Little Nightmares 1 we aren't explicitly experiencing any time loop. I do think that similar to Mono becoming the Thin Man, the lady may have always been a victim of cannibalism in the child, maybe not Six necessarily, but if everything happens for a reason in this world that is encapsulated into a time loop, maybe it's all lined up, unless the Thin Man Mono situation is an isolated incident, where it is almost a frozen in time type of accident. We don't really know the logic of the Nowhere completely, so who knows how time even works. I wanted to end off this video talking about Little Nightmares 3 and its trajectory. I'm watching a plethora of trailers and analysis videos. It truly is hard to piece together a lot of it. I do believe that although this is a separate story with separate characters, we will still probably get nods or bits and pieces here that encapsulate the world. We do see eye imagery even within the game, through the eyes themselves, but also the big baby using its eyes as a gazing weapon. I see Little Nightmares 2 as almost an exposition type of game in how it delivered its story. It gives some building blocks to understand what was going on previously when none of us knew what was going on through the first title. The Sounds of Nightmares, I believe, gave us tons of perspective through world building and even character building, through finally having characters we can better understand their motives since it's all dialogue. I'm not sure what this means for Little Nightmares 3, maybe they will expand more and more, leaving us with more questions. There was this content creator I was watching called Indie Explorer. He's very diligent in picking up a kind of cosmic imagery throughout parts of the series, such as the orrery we see depicted in the trailers for Little Nightmares 3, and one within the lady's residence. Again, I don't know exactly what this means, but perhaps it is emblematic of how time works within the Nowhere, or even how a semblant structure, such as an orrery, is depicting the way and flow of how the Nowhere works. I do think that, as usual with this series, we will be asking more questions than receiving answers, and I think that lines up with how expansive the nature of this third game is shaping up to be. The Necropolis is very large in scale, the biggest monster to date if you don't include the living walls, so at tracks we will really be understanding more just to understand less. I do hope you enjoyed some of my thoughts. I know this wasn't a hyper-analytical video by any stretch, and was more just branching out my thoughts in quite a jumbled way. I'm hoping to make a longer video perhaps about Little Nightmares when the third game is closer to release, and I'll possibly order my thoughts a bit better. Thank you for watching, have a great rest of your day.